Hi there, I'm Josh, and today we're talking about the i7-6700 in 2023. Now, I did benchmarks at both 1080 and 1440p with an RTX 2060. The i7-6700 has 4 cores and 8 threads, a max turbo of 4 GHz and a base frequency of 3.4 GHz, a TDP of 65 watts, and was launched in Q3 of 2015. I have it paired with 32 GB of RAM, so there should be no RAM bottleneck at all, and we'll see if this 4-core unit can still perform in 2023. As a disclaimer, for both the finals and Apex Legends, I did go into the practice range to record, but the actual benchmarking was done in-game, which is why the frame rate varies significantly. First up is the finals. At 1080p with the high settings, we saw an average frame rate of 55, a 1% low of 31, and a 0.1% low of 27. If you are fine with 30 FPS, then this is still a pretty good CPU, but 60 FPS is what I would consider to be the PC average frame rate that people expect, especially when paired with an RTX 2060. If we switch to 1440p with the medium settings, we saw an average frame rate of 60, a 1% low of 35, and a 0.1% low of 35. So this game actually ran better when playing at 1440p because the CPU wasn't bottlenecked as much. Next, Lethal Company at 1080p with whatever settings they have, because you can't change the settings, ran with an average frame rate of 104, a 1% low of 65, and a 0.1% low of 4. So there was jitter, but it wasn't that much considering the 1% low frame rate. However, it did happen here and there, but I would still consider this game to be playable. Baldur's Gate 3 at 1080p with the mix of high and ultra settings ran with an average frame rate of 49, a 1% low of 16, and a 0.1% low of 3. So at 1080p there was a lot of jitter. The CPU was definitely bottlenecking the RTX 2060, which is to be expected from a CPU that came out in 2015. But the reason I chose the RTX 2060 was because I wanted to give the CPU the absolute maximum it could handle. In real life practice, I would suggest nothing more than a GTX 1070 or 1066 gig or anything in the 16 series line to run these games. If we switch to 1440p with the same mix of high and ultra settings, we saw an average frame rate of 46, a 1% low of 25, and a 0.1% low of 9. So although the average frame rate was 3 FPS lower, the jitter was much better in this, although it still wasn't perfect, and this game was just a struggle to run on this 4-core 8-thread CPU. Apex Legends at 1080p with the medium settings ran with an average frame rate of 130 FPS, a 1% low of 81, and a 0.1% low of 12. And at 1440p with the medium settings, we saw an average frame rate of 112 FPS. Counter-Strike 2, as it was with the finals, unfortunately recording the game actually screwed with the frame rate a little bit. Counter-Strike 2 up next, we saw an average frame rate of 70 FPS at 1080p with the high settings. Now the recording shows a lot more jitter and a lower frame rate because recording does tank frame rates when your CPU is limited. But I would definitely recommend, instead of playing this game at 1080p with an i7-6700 and 2060, to switch it to 1440p, because at 1440p with the high settings, we saw an average frame rate of 94 FPS, which makes this game actually very playable. Destiny 2 at 1080p with the highest settings ran with an average frame rate of 94 frames per second. And this is the first time that the CPU is not bottlenecking the GPU, because when we switched it to 1440p, we actually got a much lower frame rate at 63 FPS. And last but not least, Avatar at 1080p with the low settings ran with an average frame rate of 41 frames per second, a minimum frame rate of 15, and a maximum frame rate of 61. So we weren't able to hit 60 FPS on average, but at a game like this, I consider cinematically 30 FPS to be okay. However, again, I did make 60 FPS the benchmark for most of these titles. If we switch to 1440p, we lose a whole 2 FPS at the low settings, so we get 39 with a minimum frame rate of 27 and a maximum frame rate of 51. So again, less jitter throughout, but we did see a slightly lower FPS. So it is clear that in 2023, the i7-6700 struggles with anything above like a GTX 1060 or 1070. So I would recommend sticking with those types of graphics cards. Anything in between that, like the 16 series, should run fine. But anything above that, you're going to want to see a CPU upgrade in the future. I want to compare this CPU to an i7-7700 just to see what the difference is, but that'll be a future video. Thank you so much for watching this one on the i7-6700. If you liked it, like, subscribe, do what you usually do, and as always, buy yourself something nice.